Hey everybody, Gabe here from the Spinecrackers podcast. Today I'm doing the thing, that thing being a discussion slash review slash who knows what of David Foster Wallace's novel Infinite Jest. You may have seen my our previous meme video on Infinite Jest where well, I'll let you go find that for yourself. But this is a real one. I'm actually going to be talking about the book. I read the book in full at the end of last year, and I've been sitting on making this video for a little while, not out of any sort of nervousness about talking about the book, but just to sort of let it marinate a little bit rather than sort of jumping into a kind of first reaction after immediately finishing it. If you are a member of the Spinecrackers Patreon, you will know that I did 6 videos, vlogs really, of my experience reading the book, going through a little bit of more blow-by-blow sort of impressions, plot points, things like that as I was reading. And so if you're interested in that, those are all over, as I said, on the Spinecrackers Patreon, which will be linked below. And because of that, well, I'll get into that in a second. So before I get into the substance of what I have to say about Infinite Jest, I have a number of disclaimers, as it were, that I think are kind of important to get out of the way at the beginning before we're sort of digging into the meat of my ultimate takeaways and feelings about the book. The first one is that the views expressed here are my own individually. This Spinecrackers podcast, of course, is made up of 3 individuals, and we may not all see eye to eye on this text, and the views here are my own, and I do not mean to represent the sort of unified voice of the Spinecrackers podcast on Infinite Jest by any means. Maybe we'll do a discussion of it at some point in the future altogether. The second disclaimer that I feel the need to put in here is that because of the videos that I did, the vlogs I did as I was reading the book, I am not going to go too in depth about the plot, such as it is, big plot points, characters. I'm really not going to be talking a lot about what actually happens in the book from a narrative perspective. I've done that, those videos total like something like 8 hours or something, 7 hours or whatever. And so I just don't feel the need to do that here. I am, in a sense, sort of, and one of the other reasons that I don't want to do that here is that other people have gone much more into depth on that question, because as you'll come to understand, or probably do already know, there's a significant amount of ambiguity about what actually happens in the book, the timelines, things like that, and other people have gone to much more effort than I am interested in going into in this video in terms of trying to tease out the details of all of that stuff. I have a few resources on those questions that I'll link below. But again, if you want to hear my takes on that, all of the sort of play-by-play plot stuff and moment-to-moment reactions to specific scenes and whatnot are all going to be over in the videos on the Patreon. So in a sense, I am, of you, the viewer, presuming a degree of familiarity with the text already. This is not a review in the traditional sense where I'm going to be sort of giving you a tease and some quick thoughts and recommending whether or not you should read it. I think most people who are going to be watching a video of the length that I'm expecting this to be on Infinite Jest have probably already read it, or at least know the sort of broad strokes of what's going on in the book. So I will be using character names without introducing who they are, talking about, there will be intermittent and potentially total spoilers. As I said, this raises an interesting kind of a philosophical and interpretive question about whether or not a book like Infinite Jest can be spoiled at all. I'll leave that maybe for another time. So if you're looking for that kind of traditional review, here's what happened, here's what I thought about it, etc. There are other people who have done that better than I would, almost certainly. That's not what this video is going to be. The third disclaimer that I want to get out of the way at the beginning is about some of the I don't want to say ancillary because they're important, but sort of extra textual questions about David Foster Wallace, his personal behavior, specifically towards women, even more specifically towards Mary Carr and their relationship. And I am not going to be talking similarly in depth about issues of race and gender in the text, mostly because those issues, all three of those issues, I think would take their own videos of similar length to this one to discuss in any sort of depth or with any sort of seriousness. And I don't want to sort of shoehorn those in here. And similarly to the plot, question, other people have already done that work in much more detailed and thoughtful ways than I probably would in a video like this. On issues of race, for example, I would recommend to you the Loser's Library video on reading Infinite Jest as a Black woman. That's an excellent video with a really nuanced and I think helpful discussion about those issues in the book by someone who would, maybe be affected by them. Similarly with, Wallace's personal behavior towards women, you can read D.T. Max's biography. Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, I think is the title. I haven't read it, but I've watched a few lectures that he's given and some interviews with him and so on. And so I feel pretty comfortable recommending that as a just kind of descriptive account of Wallace's relationships with women. I do have some thoughts on those issues, and I guess I'll just kind of state them dogmatically here without getting too deeply into it. I think, on issues of race in the text, generally speaking, Wallace's treatment of race, including the infamous sections written in Wallace's imagined version of African American vernacular English, are, in a word, indefensible. And the best thing that can be said about them is that they're mercifully few and far between. I think issues of gender are slightly more complicated in the book. Some people have problems with the way that he treats his female characters. Avril, specifically as a older sort of middle-aged woman. Also Joelle. I didn't think that those, I think that's a more complicated issue in the sense that his treatment of them is less egregiously stupid and politically just wrong than his treatment of race in the book, broadly speaking. Again, there's a lot in this book. It's a long fucking book, so I'm making a few broad statements. I said I didn't want to get too deeply into it, and I'm trying to avoid doing so, despite myself. The real issue, as far as I'm concerned, with gender in the book is his treatment of sort of gender nonconforming, arguably trans people, and issues of gender in a broader sense. Specifically the character of Hugh Steepley, Hugh/Helen Steepley, who is an agent of the U.S. government, who is attempting to infiltrate the Incandenza family to track down the copy of Infinite Jest, aka the Entertainment, before the Quebecois terrorists are able to do so, and whose mode of whose disguise, I suppose, is just sort of dressing up as a woman, and a lot of I suppose in Wallace's mind, comedic hay is made out of the fact that he still looks very manly and is built very sort of stoutly and traditionally masculine physical features, and yet is still apparently for some reason that Wallace finds funny, deeply attractive to heterosexual men. I don't know the point Wallace is trying to make there, if there is one. If he has a point, it is if you've watched any of my videos in the past, you know that I'm not a particularly strong editor, and so my editing mostly consists of pausing and restarting. So my dogs were making a bit of noise. If Wallace has a point with any of this stuff about gender, Steepley's cross-dressing, it's at best muddled, and at worst probably not a point worth making at all. And I tend to think the latter of those two. It all comes off as, a lot of the gender sort of stuff, it just comes off as very like mid 90s, early 2000s, like Wayne's Brothers kind of Juana Man type nonsense. And I just don't know what it's doing in this book, frankly. You can chalk it up, I guess, to some degree to the book being a product of that era, the mid 90s. And, we'll talk about the book being a product of its era significantly more in a bit. As I said, those are sort of my surface level thoughts on these issues of race and gender in Infinite Jest that I felt worth just sort of getting out of the way now. And as I say, I will say no more about them in this video, except perhaps obliquely. So a little bit about my experience reading the book. I've already mentioned that I read it over the course of 3 months, or no, I guess it would have been closer to 4 months. I set a goal for myself of trying to finish the book by the end of the year 2021. And as I said, I picked it up in mid-September, I think, early September. And my reading of it was very scattered. I read 100 pages over a few weeks, stopped reading it totally for a couple weeks, read a couple 100 more, stopped again, and then read a bunch, 300-400 pages all at once over the course of a week or so, and then did that again. So kind of, it was a couple short sections and then a couple long spurts to kind of finish it out because I wanted to get it done by the end of the year, which I did. The reason that I undertook that project in the first place, this is my first time reading the text. I'm 34. I was 33. I think when I finished it at the end of last year. My birthday is late in the year, and this will get to a larger point that I want to try to make in a bit about the sort of David Foster Wallace phenomenon in general. Which at this point I am, almost as interested in, if not more interested in, than his writing itself. Which is not a dig at the writing. I'm just saying, all I mean to say is that his sort of cultural status and, literary status is sort of sui generis, I would argue, especially in terms of modern authors. There's really not a similar kind of comparison that I can think of to what Wallace did when he was alive, and specifically with Infinite Jest. Just in terms of like the hype and how many people kind of latched onto this book as something that was, deeply, deeply meaningful to them, in a really kind of broad swath, right, across people. This wasn't a book that was only for deeply, deeply literary people already. A lot of people read this book and it mattered to them a lot. A lot of people read it and hated it. And a lot of people have issues with, the sort of culture that's developed around him, what gets called a lot of times the sort of lit bro culture, online and or in person. And people have had negative experiences with people who like this book as partners or friends or whatever. And so I don't like the term that you either love or you hate the book, because I think that that's in general a sort of surface level way of talking about books like this. And I also just think it's almost in every case just false. I know it is for me. I certainly fall somewhere in the middle of those two extremes when it comes to Infinite Jest, at least. Anyway, the reason that I wanted to read the book was because in college, it was everywhere for me. I was in college in the mid-2000s, and a small public but sort of liberal artsy type college in New York, and it was just ubiquitous. All of the sort of cool kids were reading it. There were book clubs every summer, the sort of Infinite Summer Book Club. I don't know if that's still a thing people do. Reading it, rereading it, getting together and talking about it. You would see people carrying it all over campus and coffee shops. It was, a part of my college experience in a way that was just sort of, I think, again, unique in terms of literary fiction. Of course, I know that's not going to be true for everybody, and my experience with it in that context, I think, shaped my views of the book and of Wallace going forward in my life. and other people's experiences, which will be significantly different in some cases, will shape their views or will have shaped their views. But I never read it in college. I was, of that well-known kind of cooler than cool mindset where anything that everybody else liked, I sort of wanted to avoid as a matter of principle. And I've thankfully grown out of that mentality, but that was kind of my attitude at that age. And so I never read the book. Now, what I did do was lie about reading the book when it was socially convenient at parties or among peers who had read it and were talking about it or whatever. But even then, it was a book where so much of the kind of content, what it's about, was just sort of in the ether to be absorbed osmotically if you were around a lot of people who had read the book or loved the book. And so I suppose out of a sort of sense of I don't know, wanting to do penance for the sins of having lied about having read Infinite Jest for those years of my life, I thought it was time to actually read the damn thing, and did so. Now, I did have, and this was actually my first experience with any of Wallace's fiction. I did have experience reading his nonfiction. I read Consider the Lobster and some of his other nonfiction essays, that whole collection, and some of his other nonfiction essays. And I think in my experience with people who have read Wallace, that's sort of atypical in the sense that a lot of people start with the fiction, maybe Infinite Jest itself, or maybe they've heard the Kenyon College speech or something else, along those lines. But most people, it seems, start with the fiction and move on to the nonfiction later. I was the opposite. And I will confess, I'm just going to be as straight as I can. I found his nonfiction writing to be borderline insufferable, almost to a piece, to an essay. I specifically felt that his pieces of cultural critique, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again is a good example, or the essay about the Illinois State Fair, I believe it is. I forget the title of that one. I found them to be, politically odious to where my kind of sympathies lie and lied then politically. Specifically sort of participating in this grand, tradition of, European writers, say, or American expats coming back and sort of snidely critiquing all the stupid fat Americans. It reminded me of some of Henry Miller's work after coming back from Europe, specifically The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, which is a book that I despise deeply. Wallace isn't quite that bad, and he tries to temper his social criticisms of contemporary American culture with his patented brand of kind of self-deprecation and whatnot. I didn't find that to be a particularly helpful diluting agent for what I thought were, bordering on explicitly classist views of American politics. And as a bit of a spoiler alert, Infinite Jest did not really change my view on that question, although I do think it made it a bit more subtle and nuanced. So that's sort of my story with Wallace, and how I came to read Infinite Jest and why I did so. I want to talk briefly, before I get into a few other of the substantive points I want to make here specifically about Infinite Jest, about the question, the favorite bailiwick of booktubers everywhere, the question of difficulty. Infinite Jest has a reputation for being an extremely difficult book to read. Obviously, it's quite long, and so in that sense is an unavoidable time commitment, just based on basic facts about how long it takes us to read things. I read it, as I said, in sort of fits and starts, and so I think it took me longer than it otherwise would have if I were, say, focusing on it exclusively and reading it every day and being more diligent, arguably, than I was. But I expect if I had sat down and read it alone and in those better conditions, it would have taken me, a month and a half, 2 months, something like that. So it's a long book, and it's other disclaimer. I don't really know what it means for a book to be difficult. I've never heard a good definition of that term in that context. I think what it means for a book to be difficult will depend so deeply on the individual reading the book and the context in which they're reading it, that any kind of broad proclamations on that score are bound to be unhelpful and sort of not capture a lot of the relevant cases. What I'll say about Infinite Jest is that I found the book is certainly structurally unique. I believe Wallace's editor, Michael Peach, when he first received the manuscript of Infinite Jest, the full manuscript, which was not published, it was edited down, I think, from something like 13 or 1400 pages to the current, 980 or whatever it is that we have, not including Endnotes. That pushes it to, well over 1,000. That the structure of the book felt like a fragile glass object dropped from a high height and shattering on the ground. And I think that is a really kind of helpful way to think about the experience of reading Infinite Jest and the structure of the narrative. Wallace himself famously described Infinite Jest as being structured like a Sierpinski gasket, at least in the full draft that he delivered to the publisher, and then as a sort of lopsided Sierpinski gasket in the version that we got published. Now, I don't really know what that means. I will leave it to smarter people to determine what Wallace meant by that. I don't really know what a Sierpinski gasket is, what it does. I know it's a sort of mathematical anomaly or structure, sort of akin to sort of fractal forms and things like that. And indeed, the book does sort of feel all of those ways as you read it. The narratives kind of break and reform and circle around one another, and kind of pull on each other magnetically until it coheres in something like a whole shape, And I think the way that Wallace did that was brilliant. I mean, I really loved reading the book just as an experience, being pulled through these various narratives, and then pulled back because it's all sort of temporally mixed up. The chronology is interesting and difficult. And it was a visceral sort of experience to me. Wallace is excellent at keeping you reading at different paces. One of the main things that people complain about on the question of difficulty is the endnotes, which I think there are 350 or something like that, 380 maybe. Let's get the exact number, 388. And that's something that turns a lot of people off from reading the book, which I both do and do not understand. I think that it's, sort of a goofy reason not to read a book or to complain about a book being hard. I don't know. I don't find endnotes or footnotes to be particularly difficult, but, who knows? Maybe that's because I've been reading academic writing for most of my life or, most of my adult life. But as has been commented on many times by many reviewers, the way Wallace uses endnotes is, I think, particularly is indicative of his larger approach to pacing and getting you involved in the narrative. So one of the major kind of things in the book is tennis. The large chunks of the book take place at a tennis academy, with most of the rest of the book taking place in and around a recovery house, which is geographically near the tennis academy. But many people have commented on Wallace's use of endnotes to the effect that what he's doing is, because you have to sort of physically turn back and forth between the endnotes and the main text, he's sort of mirroring the flow of a game of tennis, right? Where a ball's hit, it goes to the other side, and then it's hit back, and you sort of feel that way when you're reading through these endnotes. And the pace of the endnotes changes a lot. There will be pages where there are 5 or 6 on one page, and then you'll go for 30 or 40 without seeing a single one. which might be a sort of a longer, slower volley if we're keeping with the tennis metaphor. And I feel that Wallace is obviously very conscious of that fact and doing all of that very deliberately. And I think that applies similarly to the way that he paces and structures the entire book. The idea of it being, Sierpinski gasket or whatever, I don't really have much to say about that. I don't know what that means. I'm happy to talk about it in the comments. Please do. But clearly there's a high degree of intention and thoughtful structure behind the way Wallace put the book together, and you really feel that in reading it. At least I did. Does that make it difficult per se? I don't know. There are certainly, plot points that are sort of go away and then come back, or characters that you don't see for a long time and you maybe forget their role or when you last saw them, and it can be a bit disorienting that way. There's certainly a lot to keep track of, just in terms of plot events and the cast of characters. The other aspect of the book that I think some people would find difficult is just the language. I think Wallace is a very strong writer just syntactically. I didn't find the book difficult to follow per se, but he does use a lot of specialized terminology. There are long sections where there's specialized medical terminology that get used. And he, of course, inserts his own sort of neologisms, and it's very difficult because he's using all these other real words that you may not know or may have to look up. It's difficult to know when he's inserted one of his own creations and when it's just a word that you don't know. And I don't know. I found that enjoyable. I like learning new words. I like looking up words. I didn't mind it. If that sounds difficult or arduous or annoying to you, you may feel differently about the book. I should also say that I read the book with a, and I'll link the site that I used below, but a sort of page by page breakdown of the words you're unlikely to know, some of the references, what was a Wallace invention, and so on and so forth. At least mostly I did. I kind of stopped doing that, the last 200 pages or so. But for most of the book, I had that at hand while I was reading. And I don't know. I enjoy that. That's not something that I find annoying or that it breaks up the reading experience too much. And I also think that Wallace, in his use of Endnotes, for example, wanted the reading experience to be kind of broken up that way, the going back and forth. And so me going back and forth between the screen and some of the words and so on, I think was maybe just another instantiation of that. So is the book difficult? The answer is I don't really know. I didn't find it to be particularly difficult, but that may just be because of my own sort of predilections and the things that bother me and the things that don't. You may feel very differently. Okay, the next sort of issue that I want to talk about is, and I guess we're sort of moving to my main thoughts on the book now. I think that this book, as I said, is one that resonates with a lot of people. Some of the main themes, of course, are addiction, entertainment, the sort of growing sense of ennui in American culture, then in the 20th century and leading into the 21st, and a sort of lack of direction that individuals have, depression, anxiety, our relationships to each other in a rapidly sort of technifying world, and of course, sort of dysfunctional family problems. Virtually every character in this book has a family origin story of very varyingly disturbing, traumatic natures. You see, more and less of that based on how central the character is to the story or how much you get of their background or whatever. But virtually every character that you learn anything about in terms of their personal history has a deeply, deeply traumatic family background. And obviously, a lot of people can relate to that because a lot of people have deeply, deeply traumatic family histories and family backgrounds. A lot of people have problems with addiction, with depression. And Wallace is maybe the best writer that I've ever encountered in terms of describing those things from a sort of phenomenological, subjective point of view. I don't consider myself to be depressed or have depression, so I could probably even relate less than many other people will be able to. But reading some of Wallace's description, for example, of Joelle's attempted suicide relatively early on in the book, or some of the experiences of sort of detoxing that we get from various characters, or Gately's sort of memory back to his rock bottom moment we get at the end, which is, beautiful, beautiful scene, just absolutely like flawlessly executed, are just so real and so just visceral that I think it's impossible to imagine that they weren't really Wallace talking about his own experiences in some way or another. One of the things that I think is interesting about the book on that score is that Wallace himself had problems with drugs, alcohol, so on, but for a long time after the book was published, didn't really admit that that's what he was drawing on. He sort of talked about going to all of these AA meetings and NA meetings around Boston as pure sort of research for the book. But of course, he was actually a member of AA for most of his adult life. And I think it's interesting to think about why he felt the need to keep that hidden, I suppose, and how that interfaces with some of the characters in the book. On that score about addiction and Wallace's relationship to addiction, there's a larger point here about American culture that I'll get to in a minute, because this is actually my biggest issue with the book, and so I'm going to talk about it at length in a minute. But I became at various points in the book borderline uncomfortable with Wallace's descriptions of the AA meetings and some of the AA characters, in the sense that it sort of, and full disclosure, I don't really want to get into this discussion here, but I have very mixed feelings about AA as a program, about its methods, about its philosophical priors, and so on. And Wallace gets into that a lot in the book, of course. But there were moments where it started to come off as borderline propagandistic, as if I was reading a very, very well written and very sort of literarily gripping pamphlet or something that someone would hand out at an actual AA meeting. Obviously, that sort of particular gripe is going to be something that is maybe unique to me, but I'd be curious to hear if anyone else had that kind of experience reading the book. And I just think it's interesting in light of Wallace's own relationship to these sorts of programs. The sort of larger point that I think Wallace is trying to make through these individual characters, Hal, Gately, specifically Joelle, about depression, about addiction in the modern world, is, I think, wrapped up in Wallace's larger social critique, which is that in the West, in arguably America specifically, we are addicted to technology, to entertainment. We have sort of substituted the classic American pursuit of happiness for the pursuit of base pleasure. And I think Wallace has a sort of very robust, traditional, arguably Aristotelian view of happiness, in the sense that happiness is this, total sense of fulfillment, this sense of self-actualization and living up to your potential and so on and so forth, that is, if not incompatible, certainly not reducible to some sort of basic moment-to-moment pleasure. And I believe that Wallace thinks that we have erred much too far on the side of pleasure in these sorts of calculations in contemporary American culture. Now, I think that this is and obviously the device he uses to sort of drive this point home is the entertainment, or the film Infinite Jest, which in the book was created by Hal's father, who committed suicide. It was his last film project, and the sort of deal with Infinite Jest in the book, the film, is that it is a theoretical movie. Well, it's actual in the book, obviously, but it's a film that is so entertaining, so gripping, that if you watch it, you are instantly addicted to the point that you care about nothing else. Basic sustenance, hygiene, loved ones. All you want to do is sit there and watch this film over and over and over again until you waste away and die. You know, I personally think this is a little bit heavy-handed. You know, people have talked about this novel being a sort of novelization of Postman's work, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is a classic. Although, a sort of classic work of American cultural criticism. Although I would argue that book shares with Infinite Jest a certain type of outdatedness in its cultural critique, which I'll talk about more. But anyway, I think that Wallace's social critique, taken in toto as a whole, about contemporary American culture, technologization, our addictions to sort of pleasure and moment-to-moment satisfaction, I think they just frankly don't hit as hard in 2022 now, wow, as they did probably in the mid-90s. Now, that's not to take away from the book. It's I don't want to commit the sort of fallacy of presentism or anything here where I'm talking about something outside of its context entirely. And, I want to make clear that there are things in here that are genuinely eerie in terms of Wallace predicting what would come to pass in the future, if America sort of were to continue down the path that he's laid out for it in the book. For example, he almost with a scary degree of accuracy predicts the existence of services like Netflix, where you can, bear in mind that this was in the 90s, this was all, Blockbuster video still and all that, but where you can order directly to your TV or computer screen any type of entertainment that you might want to watch. He predicts arguably things like Instagram filters, Snapchat filters, where people overlay various faces onto themselves when they're engaged in sort of video chat calls. There's arguably an even sort of, there's an eerie parallel even to the election of Trump, where the president, during most of the time that the action takes place in Infinite Jest, is a former entertainer. In this book, he's kind of like a doo-wop-y kind of former singer star. But he has a lot of the similar characteristics, I would argue, to Trump in the sense of what people sort of liked about him and what made him kind of electable, all the way down to weird personal stuff like being obsessed with germs and cleanliness, which Trump was. So there's a lot of very eerie and bizarre predictive moments in the book that kind of just send a chill up your spine. And I think that speaks to Wallace's, powers in terms of thinking about and analyzing culture and this kind of the kind of flow of history. Obviously, there's other stuff in the book that's a little extreme compared to what we have now. There's all the names of the years have become advertisements for companies, so companies will pay and buy a specific year. So the years are things like the year of the Depend adult undergarment, the year of Glad. And there's a number of others, and various other kind of like culturally predictive things that are really interesting. But for every accurate prediction, I suppose there is, I think, a larger view of American culture that I think in Wallace is actually pretty impoverished. As I mentioned earlier, he kind of takes this European kind of expat elitist view of Americans as being sort of just fat and lazy and addicted to food and entertainment and whatever. And as I said, I think that this is something that you can see on display in a lot of his nonfiction as well. And, this is something that I think really is a problem for Wallace's view of the country and of culture. Wallace seems to take the view a la somebody like Jordan Peterson or some of these other kind of self-help gurus that are around today, that what you need to do or at least where you need to start, is with yourself. And you yourself can kind of wake up day to day and make choices that can meaningfully change your life and your relationship to the world. Now, that may sound, and specifically, that those things take precedence over larger scale kind of political questions, class issues, things like that, that you kind of are the nexus of choice and change in your own life. And you are the driving force, sort of master of your destiny type of thing. It's a bit of a simplification, but I think at bottom, this is Wallace's view of the individual in contemporary society. You know, if you listen to the Kenyon lecture, he talks a lot about, you know, waking up and sort of making the choice not to be an asshole to the person who cuts you off in traffic, or choosing to be sympathetic to the lady who's yelling at her kids in the checkout line at the grocery store, I think, are a couple of the examples that he uses. And I think that this is, you know, these are obviously sort of, you know, simple examples, but I think this extends in a broader sense to Wallace's view of, you know, what he thinks is a uniquely American problem of sort of addiction and depression and so on, that, you know, you can just choose not to be addicted, choose not to be as depressed, choose to behave differently, and that will sort of have rippling effects out through your life that will make it sort of better. And obviously, I would never advise anyone against trying to make choices to make their life better or make it less depressing or whatever. But what it does do is minimize and ignore the issues of larger social forces. And I think that's something that Wallace is deeply guilty of. I think that, you know, one sort of question that we need to ask, you know, let me back up for a second. There's a scene between Steeply and the agent, double, triple, quadruple, we don't really know, agent of the Quebecois terrorist organization, one of them, Marat, I'm not exactly sure, where, and I will say I love the dialogue scenes between those two that are peppered throughout the text, because I think they're really interesting kind of Socratic, maybe more properly Platonic dialogue moments where a lot of Wallace is doing a lot of kind of philosophical work in expounding his view of American culture and American life, and some of the distinctions that exist between America and the way that other cultures and countries view their roles as citizens, as individuals, as members of families, things like that. And there's a really interesting conversation that happens between those two on the question of choice. And I think that, you know, where Steeply is sort of talking up as one of the foundational American principles, kind of freedom of choice, the freedom to do what you want with your life, to choose who you want to be, and not being sort of, you know, bounded by all of these artificial, traditional sort of roles, social roles or cultural roles or whatever. And Marat is sort of arguing that you know, sort of the point that, like, well, look where that's gotten you. How's that working out, arguably, right? And he's sort of talking about the sort of big gotcha at the end of that conversation is, you know, Steeply is talking about why the terrorists should not, you know, release this addictive videotape into the American culture, which would be a sort of mass terrorist event because people would be watching it, they'd be addicted. I mean, it works if you step in the room and see it, like, you're hooked. And Marat says, well, even if we did release it, or even if one of these terrorist groups did release it, you know, wouldn't it ultimately be on you if you chose to watch it based on how you venerate choice? And you can either freely choose to watch it or freely choose not to watch it. And that's sort of a big kind of argumentative gotcha moment between Marat and Steeply. And I think that in Wallace's rhetoric and the way that he talks about American culture, I actually think he's more on Marat's side here than maybe he would want to admit, or maybe he would admit it. But I think it's unjustified and it's a silly position, particularly in a world like we live in 2022. what I think Wallace misses in this sort of discourse of choice, and what I see, someone like, I think about someone like Mark Fisher, who wrote Capitalist Realism, and who I think has theorized in a way that is much more relevant and important today than kind of what Wallace is talking about here with this, basic kind of like, Americans are fat, lazy, and addicted. Is that the landscape of choice that we think we have is an illusion, right? The options that are available to us on a day-to-day basis, in terms of choosing to improve our lives, saying no to sort of addiction and addictive habits, and these sort of stultifying, plopping down in front of the TV to watch, Netflix or whatever all day. It may seem on a superficial level that you can at any moment choose not to do any one of those particular things, and of course that's true. But what you can't choose to do is to break out of the entire system, the entire structure on your own. And I think that Wallace seems to sort of be, I would say, naively suggesting that that's possible. In a world where depression and anxiety and addiction have ballooned to levels that I think are even beyond what Wallace could have possibly envisioned, to the point that those things are the default operating sort of state of most people, to echo back to Wallace's Kenyon address, to act as if we, on an individual sort of windowless monad basis, can wake up and break out of those structures, those systems, whether it's capitalism or the sort of various oppressions of our political system, is I think just false, and I think unhelpful as a sort of cultural critique. Is it arguably a good thing for the fish to realize the type of water that it's swimming in? Sure, but for all that, the fish also can't survive outside that water, right? And I think that this is sort of something that Wallace sort of totally glosses over in a way that just does not speak to the problems that we have today, and arguably not even the problems that we had back then. I was young in '96, and so I don't have as deep a sort of lived experience with the cultural climate at that time. But, functionally, what does choice mean anymore in the face of these totalizing systems that are always one step ahead of us, always, enclosing our decisions before we even make them? I think in a lot of ways, Wallace is the real American here, in the sense that thinking that we can just make these choices and improve our life and arguably improve the world without realizing that functionally the space of choice doesn't really exist anymore. Capitalist realism, to use Fisher's term, has sort of won the day. And what do we do in the face of that? Maybe these sort of day-to-day quotidian decisions to be nice to the lady in line at the grocery store are enough. Maybe that sort of moment-to-moment resistance or whatever is enough to sustain and enough to make life a little bit more bearable. It might be. But in terms of changing social systems, changing cultures, I'll leave the discussion of how to actually effectively do that to others, to philosophers and political theorists, and maybe for another time. But what I know is not the answer is to just wake up and heroically do it alone and resolve to just change on your own. And it seems that that's sort of the view Wallace lands on in this text. And so, in that sense, Infinite Jest is a book of big, universal human themes, but it's also a book that's deeply, deeply embedded in a particular time and place, the 90s, the mid-90s in America. And I think that for all of the predictive power that Wallace brought to bear on some of the specifics of, Netflix or filters or Trump or whatever it is, he missed quite a bit of the big picture that he was trying to capture. And, you know, all of that sort of leaves me with the question, what does Infinite Jest have left to say to us today as a social critique? Certainly, as a subjective matter, it will always resonate with people who have experiences of depression. It will always resonate with people who have experiences of addiction and so on. But how does it speak to those experiences of depression and addiction? And how does it contextualize them? What happens when the shape of depression and the shape of addiction changes so radically as it has even in the 30 years since the book was published, 25 years, whatever it is? I'm not sure. And so I wonder if I don't know that the depressions that plague us today are the ones that plagued Wallace. I don't know if the addictions today are the ones that plagued Wallace, or even if they're the ones that he predicted were waiting for us out there in the sort of hissing static of digitization. I think things have mutated and changed so radically in ways that Wallace arguably could not have predicted. Certainly almost could not have predicted. And I don't mean this as a dig on the book, right? Like, this is sort of just I'm ruminating about what is there in this that speaks to our experience socially and culturally anymore. And I'm not sure. And so I'm left wondering if what the book is at this point is an exercise in nostalgia, a sort of, certainly people have just individual nostalgic experiences with the book, reading it at a particular time in their life where it hit them importantly and it mattered to them deeply. And I'm not trying to take anything away from that. I have nostalgic feelings towards the book based on, my experience with it in college and with other people who had read it. Some experiences not so great. But is the book speaking to us on that level anymore? Or is it a sort of exercise in a kind of grim wistfulness for a previously imagined future that, while dystopian, was less dystopian than the one we actually wound up with? And I don't know the answer to that question. It's not, I don't think it's obvious, but that is sort of where I'm at with Infinite Jest. I think that there's aspects of this book that are enduringly beautiful, enduringly sad, enduringly hilarious, and it will always have that. But I don't know what it has left at this point in history as a sort of cultural commentary, as a way of dealing with some of the issues that it so ably kind of names and expresses from a phenomenological perspective. And it may, of course, be that I'm making too much out of all of this. It may be that Wallace wasn't after some sort of broad claim about American culture or the future of technology or our relationships to one another. I think that claim is implausible. I think he was certainly after those things, and I think his interviews and his other nonfiction texts and so on bear that out. I just wonder if the well is tapped a little bit in terms of this book and what it has to say about those issues. And, for that reason, that's sort of the reason that I'm giving this video the title that I have. I liked reading the book a lot. It was an experience that I'll remember for a while, but I don't think there's any reason for me to go back to it personally. Yeah. So those are kind of my thoughts about Infinite Jest. Sorry to end on a bit of an ambiguous and arguably a downer note there, but I hope you enjoyed the video. Please comment, subscribe. Again, the Patreon links and all that stuff will be below. Let me know your thoughts. Am I totally off base? Am I totally missing something, some key element here? It's possible. I hope the discussion will be ongoing in the comments and over on the Discord if you're a patron. So hopefully we'll see you there. And thanks so much for watching.